Thank you, everyone, for a really helpful webinar. Throughout this discussion, you have identified digital access as a confluence of multiple factors, including technological infrastructure, socioeconomic resources, and pedagogy. Considering that we are all educators, pedagogy is the tool we readily have available to use. So my question is, to what extent can creative uses of pedagogy mitigate the existing divides in digital access and change the calculus for the most marginalized populations? Are there other pedagogical tools you have identified beyond, for instance, the Raspberry Pi initiatives, or the use of radio or televised educational programming in low and middle income countries? Thank you.
Well, I guess that's probably a question addressed to everyone, but what do you think, Sue? Do you, because you mentioned Raspberry Pi, do you have a view?
Yes, and I think it's a very interesting question, because it's really important that we can make the motivation that I referred to in talking about learning outcomes around digital, that we think about motivating young people to be able to want to gain the sort of digital skills and the digital knowledge that will take them a long way. And I think sometimes a very inquiry-based approach to introducing digital and trying, and Tom talked about empowering young people by looking at things that really matter to young people and looking at digital solutions for those, and where digital tools might come in. And I think that's within the realms of the teacher in introducing digital literacy and digital skills and digital competencies, enabling all young people, wherever their background, to be able to see that this can be important to them. And I also think that there are other things like working together, working collaboratively, working on projects that are actually very contextualized to the local areas and relevant to the community, can also help in this kind of like motivational and empowering way, and make sense to all young people, if that helps.
Well, I mean, do any other members of the panel want to pick that up?
Yeah, I'd be quite happy to chip in if that's okay. Especially from a kind of southern perspective. So when we talk about low-income countries, they're not really just southerly anymore, but when we talk from a low-income countries perspective, we have to ask ourselves, what are the real game changers? Where could you get out more, so to speak, than what you put in? So, and if you say, okay, well, we're going to give a tablet to every child, or we're going to give a phone to every child, there's just a natural scaling problem with that, because the cost of a phone is what it is. And even if it's really cheap, even if it's just $15 for a non-smartphone, once you have 1 million children and you need to get a new phone every 2 years, it just goes way beyond what donor funding or national funding makes available. So the question is, what are the real kind of game changers in this? And I think one of the game changers is to really think about the things that are already scaling, right? So most education systems are desperately trying to get hold of better education data for their whole country, right? And so, for example, there's some really interesting approaches that using geospatial data for catchment area assessment. So don't build schools randomly, but do some geospatial assessments that will tell you where the schools need to be built to minimize walking distances for children. And technologies like that, while they're not at the child level or even at the teacher level, they could make a huge impact by giving more children access to school, getting them faster to school. Another thing that we also saw with OER for schools is this question of open resources. There is still so much reliance on commercial textbooks, and actually the Open Up Resources Initiative in the USA, one of the higher income countries around the planet, have actually switched 12 states over to openly licensed core curriculum materials, because there was a saving for those states in the United States, right? And so in the low-income countries, we need to learn from that, and we need to really think about what could we do to really massively accelerate development.
Yeah, I'd echo lots of comments there. I mean, I think the point around Bjorn mentioned around things like, you know, OER, kind of open educational resources, is a real key kind of aspect to that. And that's not, you know, I think that applies to every kind of nation and region in the world. The idea that's I think that has applicability and has massive impact. I think I fear the kind of COVID sort of crisis has driven thinking around the solution or the endpoint is just to give people a device and a dongle, and your job is done. It's like, you know, government are like, well, we did well there. Like, that's what a great result for us. And I think that's the start of the solution, because that actually is just really brought to the fore, which we, you know, the data had already kind of suggested it, but, you know, we've seen the kind of the inequity or the inequality, or certainly the kind of digital and data poverty challenge with this. And actually, it's not just about giving, you know, kids a tablet or access to, you know, kind of connectivity. So I fear some of this, you know, this is where you kind of get the wicked issue stuff, because actually it's easy to do, you know, you need to fix some of those other problems, and needs kind of cross-government portfolio initiatives. And it is, you know, it's a bit like solve the public health crisis now, and you don't downstream have to address when people have diabetes and obesity. And I think that's sometimes the challenge with some of these issues, when it is much easier to find the capital expenditure to buy a load of tablets, and not to solve the ongoing revenue spend for the next kind of 15, 20 years. So maybe that's, you know, the point I was alluding to was around new models for financing some of this stuff. It's the sustainability of some of these interventions, and to recognize that actually it isn't just thinking in the, you know, the 5 years of a government. You know, you do have to think about kind of multi-government, that longer term, you know, future generation stuff, which is that you have to change the mindset for some of these problems.
Well, thanks, Tom. Sarah, you look like you.
Yeah, just, I mean, the others have said a lot of the things I totally agree with. Just one or two maybe small points. I mean, on Tom's last point, yes, and I think, you know, having kind of effective and affordable and sustainable uses of technologies, we're going to require those kind of partnerships, planning ahead, long-term thinking, systems thinking, political will, which he's alluded to in his talk already, leadership, you know, commitment across a whole range of stakeholders, government as well as others. And, you know, it's just essential for that kind of joined up thinking to be in place. The other thing, I guess the other point I would just say on the pedagogy, I mean, Bjorn's alluded to it with the OER for schools thing, but it's also about thinking how pedagogy can be adapted towards reaching, you know, the most marginalized learners, and developing inclusive and culturally appropriate pedagogies, gender responsive pedagogies. There's some pioneering approaches in those areas, but it's all too far and few between, you know, yeah, just too rare, basically. So yeah, just wanting to raise the need and the hope that, you know, we can move forward in addressing that more systematically.
Oh, thank you all very much. Kevin, can I go back to you? Have they sort of answered your question, or do you have any thoughts and responses on that?
I've taken 2 pages of notes in those couple of minutes of talking. So yes, you've answered my question. Thank you. That was extremely helpful.